Most people believe the safest thing to do when life becomes uncertain is to move faster. When answers don't come, when someone's words linger in the mind, when the future refuses to reveal its next step, the instinct is almost automatic. Fix it. Decide something. Do anything. Just don't stand still inside the unknown. But here's the quiet truth few people notice. The more we rush to escape uncertainty, the more unstable everything begins to feel. It's a bit like standing on a narrow bridge that sways with the wind. The faster you try to cross it, the more it trembles beneath your feet. Every hurried step adds another ripple, another moment of imbalance. Yet something surprising happens when you stop. Not forever, just long enough to breathe. In that small pause, the bridge begins to settle. The ropes stop shaking so wildly. Your body remembers something it had forgotten. That balance doesn't come from forcing the world to be certain. It comes from learning how to stand calmly in the middle of what isn't. Today's story is about a man who discovered this lesson in the most unexpected place, on a swaying bridge above a quiet valley. And what he learned there changed the way he faced criticism, uncertainty, disappointment, and the restless thoughts that visit all of us. Because sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is nothing at all. And once you understand why, uncertainty stops feeling like a threat and starts becoming something very different. The first sign usually arrives quietly. A message unanswered, a plan delayed, a future that refuses to explain itself. Most people feel it in the chest before they can name it. The urge to move, to fix, to rush somewhere just to escape that uneasy fog of not knowing. It's funny how quickly the mind begins pacing, even when the body is perfectly still. And somehow, the more uncertain the path ahead becomes, the louder that restless inner voice grows. There's a peculiar discomfort in waiting without guarantees. Not dramatic waiting, no thunder, no crisis. Just that quiet pause where life hasn't yet decided what comes next. People sit in rooms, scroll through phones, replay conversations, wondering if they missed something. The mind tries to stitch together answers that simply aren't there yet. And oh, it doesn't like that very much. Somewhere inside that silence, a thought often appears. If I don't do something right now, I might lose everything. So the heart beats a little faster. Decisions feel urgent. Messages get sent too quickly. Words slip out sharper than intended. It's the old instinct to outrun discomfort, as if uncertainty were a storm that might swallow us whole if we stand still too long. Yet the strange thing is this: running rarely quiets the storm. If anything, it scatters the clouds wider. People react to criticism too fast, try to solve rejection in one breath, or rush to repair moments that simply needed time to breathe. The mind insists movement equals safety, even when experience whispers otherwise. Picture someone standing on a narrow wooden bridge suspended above a wide valley. The wind moves gently at first, almost kindly, but the moment the person notices the height, their grip tightens. The boards creak. The bridge sways just enough to awaken a familiar tension behind the ribs. Now here's the curious part. The more they rush across, the more the bridge trembles beneath their feet. Each hurried step sends another ripple through the ropes. The valley hasn't changed. The wind hasn't grown stronger. Still, the movement itself makes everything feel less stable. Most people have stood on bridges like that, not wooden ones perhaps, but emotional ones, waiting for someone's reply, sitting with the echo of a rude comment, facing a decision without knowing which step will hold. In those moments, the instinct is almost automatic. Move faster, think harder, force certainty into existence. But what if the bridge isn't asking for speed at all? What if the trembling isn't the wind or the valley or the future, but the hurried steps themselves? That quiet possibility lingers there, barely noticeable at first, like a whisper carried across the ropes. And somewhere not too far from that swaying bridge, someone else once learned a very different way to stand when the ground feels uncertain. Not far from that narrow bridge, the morning air often carried a calm that most travelers overlooked. The valley below would breathe slowly in the early light, mist rising like a quiet thought that had no hurry to become an answer. Many who crossed the bridge barely noticed it. They were too busy moving, too focused on reaching the other side before their nerves convinced them to turn back. Yet, every so often, someone paused long enough to feel something curious. The bridge, which seemed so unstable during hurried steps, would begin to settle when the travelers stopped moving. The ropes stopped shaking. The wooden boards beneath their feet found their balance again. It wasn't magic, just a quiet shift that revealed something most people never gave themselves time to notice. A young traveler named Daniel had never realized this. To him, Uncertainty felt like standing in the middle of that bridge, with the wind pushing from every direction. His mind worked like a compass that spun wildly whenever life refused to provide clear instructions. If someone criticized him, he reacted quickly. If plans changed, he scrambled to control them. Stillness to him felt dangerously close to losing control. So he moved through life the same way he crossed bridges. Quick steps, tight jaw, always trying to reach solid ground before fear caught up. In conversations, he answered too fast. When disappointment arrived, he rushed to fix it. When loneliness whispered in quiet moments, he filled the silence with distractions. Action gave him the feeling of control, even if that feeling faded soon after. But something about that bridge had begun to bother him. Each time he hurried across, the trembling worsened. Each time he rushed to regain certainty in life, the same strange instability followed him. It was as if the harder he tried to force security into existence, the more fragile everything felt. One afternoon, after another restless crossing, Daniel stopped halfway without meaning to. His breath had grown uneven, so he placed one hand on the rope beside him and paused. Just a moment, nothing dramatic. Yet within seconds he noticed something surprising. The bridge calmed. Not completely, but enough that the sway softened. The wind was still there. The valley still stretched endlessly below. And yet, the ground beneath him felt more reliable the moment he stopped fighting it. Daniel blinked, almost amused at the discovery. Like someone who had just realized water becomes clear when you stop stirring it. He took a slower breath this time. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The kind of breath people rarely take when they're rushing through worry. And oddly enough, the bridge steadied a little more. Daniel didn't yet understand what this meant, but somewhere inside that quiet pause, a small question began forming, one that would change the way he saw uncertainty forever. And not long after that moment, someone else would step onto the bridge beside him, someone who already knew the answer Daniel had just begun to glimpse. Daniel had always believed that movement was the only way to stay safe. If life became uncertain, he hurried. If silence stretched too long, he filled it with plans, messages, explanations, anything that made him feel he was steering the ship again. Stillness felt suspicious to him, like standing in the middle of a road and hoping no car would appear. So he kept moving, often before he even understood what he was running from. It had been that kind of week for him. A conversation at work ended with an ambiguous remark that lingered longer than it should have. A friend hadn't replied to a message for 2 days. Even a simple plan for the weekend had quietly unraveled. None of it was catastrophic, but together it created that familiar fog of not knowing. And Daniel's mind, it didn't enjoy fog. His thoughts began spinning the way a loose compass needle trembles when placed too close to a magnet. One moment he imagined apologizing for something he hadn't even done. The next moment he drafted a long explanation in his head, rehearsing sentences as if clarity could be forced into existence by sheer effort. He walked faster than usual, shoulders tight, as if his body had joined the argument. That afternoon he returned to the bridge, though he hadn't planned to. Perhaps it had become a quiet place for sorting the knots in his mind. The wind moved gently through the valley, brushing against the wooden planks with a sound that felt almost like breathing. Daniel stepped onto the bridge again, already feeling the familiar sway beneath his shoes. And just like before, the moment he began to hurry across, the trembling returned. The ropes shivered slightly. The boards creaked. His heart responded instantly, beating faster as if confirming what his mind already feared. See? Standing here isn't safe. He tightened his grip on the side rope and moved quicker, hoping speed would carry him out of discomfort. But halfway across, something in him faltered. Perhaps it was the fatigue of trying to control too many invisible things. Perhaps it was the quiet memory of how the bridge had steadied when he paused the day before. Either way, his steps slowed, though the nervous energy inside him had not. He stood there again, suspended between two sides of the valley, watching the bridge sway beneath him like the surface of disturbed water. The wind hadn't changed, the height hadn't changed, yet his chest felt tight with the familiar urge to fix the moment immediately. And while Daniel wrestled with that restless instinct, another pair of footsteps began approaching from the far end of the bridge. Slow, unhurried, almost as if the person walking toward him had never felt threatened by uncertainty at all. Daniel stood there for a moment longer, his hands lightly gripping the rope that framed the bridge. Beneath him, the valley stretched wide and quiet, but the wooden planks continued their subtle trembling. It wasn't violent, just enough movement to remind him that balance here was never guaranteed. The bridge responded to every shift in weight, every hurried step, every tight muscle in his body. The strange thing was how closely the bridge seemed to mirror what was happening inside him. When his thoughts raced, the boards beneath his feet felt less steady. When his breathing became shallow, the ropes seemed to whisper louder in the wind. It was almost as if the bridge had become a living reflection of his own restless mind. He looked down at his shoes, watching the boards tilt slightly with the rhythm of his stance. Funny, he thought quietly, how a person can feel so certain about their fear even when nothing has truly changed. The valley was the same valley it had been yesterday. The ropes were strong. The path still led safely to the other side. But fear, as Daniel was learning, didn't always wait for facts. It grew from movement inside the mind, much like ripples spreading across a lake after a stone has been tossed. One anxious thought led to another. One hurried step caused another sway. Soon enough, the entire surface seemed unstable, even if the water itself was calm underneath. He tried something small without thinking too much about it. Daniel loosened his shoulders and took one slow breath. Just one, in through the nose, gently out through the mouth. Nothing dramatic, no meditation posture, no grand realization, just a quiet breath offered to the moment. The bridge responded almost immediately. The trembling softened slightly. The ropes swayed less sharply. It was subtle, the kind of change someone might miss if they weren't paying attention. But Daniel noticed it this time. Curious now, he placed both feet more firmly on the wood and allowed another slow breath to settle into his chest. The boards beneath him didn't stop moving entirely. Bridges rarely do. But they seemed less chaotic, like water after the first ripples have begun to fade. Daniel tilted his head, studying the quiet rhythm of the bridge as it gently corrected itself. And just as he began to sense that this strange connection between stillness and balance might mean something, the approaching footsteps he had heard earlier grew closer, steady and unhurried, as if their owner had crossed many bridges without ever feeling the need to rush. The footsteps reached the middle of the bridge with an ease that immediately caught Daniel's attention. An older man approached, moving slowly, but with a kind of quiet certainty in his posture. His steps were neither cautious nor hurried, just steady. The bridge swayed beneath him the same way it did for Daniel, yet somehow it seemed calmer around his presence. The man stopped a few steps away and rested one hand lightly on the rope, almost as if greeting an old friend. His eyes wandered briefly across the valley before settling on Daniel, who was still gripping the rope with the determination of someone trying to keep the world from tipping. The man smiled, not in amusement, but with the gentle understanding of someone who had stood in that same place many times before. "First time noticing the bridge move?" he asked softly. Daniel let out a quiet breath that was half a laugh, half a confession. "It feels like it moves more when I try to get across quickly," he admitted, glancing down at the restless planks. "I thought moving faster would make it safer, but it only seems to shake more." The man nodded slowly, as though Daniel had just spoken a familiar truth. "That happens," he said. "Bridges are like that sometimes. The more we fight the sway, the more we help create it." He gently shifted his weight, and the bridge moved beneath him, but only slightly, almost as if responding to a calm conversation. Daniel watched him carefully. The older man's shoulders were relaxed, his breathing slow and unforced. Even the way he stood seemed different, as if the bridge were supporting him rather than challenging him. For a moment, Daniel wondered whether the man simply wasn't afraid of falling. "You see," the man continued, glancing at the ropes that stretched toward both ends of the valley. "Most people believe stability comes from controlling the bridge, but the bridge doesn't need controlling. It only asks for balance." Daniel frowned slightly, considering the idea. Balance sounded simple when spoken aloud, yet his body still held the tension of someone expecting the ground to betray him at any second. The man noticed. With a small gesture, he tapped the wooden plank gently with his shoe. "Try something," he said kindly. "Don't rush to the other side. Just stand here for a moment. Let the bridge remember its balance." Daniel hesitated, but something about the man's calm presence made the suggestion feel safe enough to try. And as the wind whispered through the valley, the two of them remained there on the swaying bridge, one who had just begun to learn, and one who seemed to have known this quiet secret for a very long time. Daniel stood beside the older man, both of them balanced above the quiet valley. The bridge continued its gentle sway, though it felt different now, less like a threat, more like a rhythm that had always been there. The man kept his gaze on the distant hills, as if he had all the time in the world. And in a way, his calm made the wind seem softer. "Most people think the danger comes from the bridge," the man said after a moment. "But it's rarely the bridge." He tapped the rope lightly with his fingers. "It's the rushing, the tightening, the feeling that you must solve everything before the ground settles." Daniel listened, his hands still resting on the rope, though his grip had softened. Something about the man's voice made the moment feel slower, like time had quietly stretched itself. The valley below remained exactly the same, wide, quiet, patient. "Watch," the man continued gently. He planted both feet firmly on the plank and inhaled slowly through his nose. Not dramatically, just a quiet, steady breath. Then he exhaled through his mouth, as if letting the wind carry away whatever tension might have been hiding in his chest. "Bridges settle when the traveler settles," he said. Daniel tried the same thing. One slow breath in, one slow breath out. The first felt awkward, like wearing a coat that didn't quite fit. His mind still wanted to rush ahead, thinking about the unanswered message, the uncertain plans, the future that refused to reveal itself. But the man simply waited. So Daniel tried again. This time he allowed his shoulders to drop slightly. His feet pressed more evenly into the wood. The breath left his chest more gently, almost like a quiet sigh he hadn't realized he was holding. The bridge softened its sway once more. Daniel blinked, noticing the subtle change. "It's strange," he said quietly. "Nothing out here has changed." The older man smiled. "Exactly." He leaned slightly on the rope, his expression warm with a hint of amusement. "Uncertainty is still here. The valley hasn't disappeared. But when you stop fighting the moment, your body remembers how to balance within it." Daniel looked down at the planks beneath his feet again. For the first time since stepping onto the bridge, he wasn't imagining how quickly he could escape to the other side. Instead, he felt the quiet strength of the wood holding him where he stood. And though he didn't fully understand it yet, something inside him had just begun to steady, much like the bridge beneath his feet. For a while, Daniel and the older man remained on the bridge without speaking. The wind passed through the valley in long, quiet breaths, moving the ropes just enough to remind them the bridge was alive with motion. Yet something inside Daniel had shifted. The urge to hurry was still there, but it no longer shouted as loudly as before. He placed both feet evenly on the wood again and tried the slow breath once more. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The kind of breath a person might take while watching the tide roll in and out. The bridge swayed gently beneath him, but it no longer felt like an enemy. Still, old habits don't disappear in a single afternoon. A thought about the unanswered message returned, sharp and persistent. His chest tightened for a moment, and the familiar impulse whispered, "You should do something about it right now." Daniel almost laughed softly at himself. Instead of reacting, he stayed where he was. The mentor noticed the small battle happening behind Daniel's eyes. He didn't interrupt. He simply stood nearby, relaxed, like someone watching clouds pass without needing to chase them. That quiet presence gave Daniel permission to experiment with something unfamiliar, waiting. Another breath, slower this time. The bridge moved slightly, but it no longer startled him. Daniel imagined the motion like the surface of water settling after a pebble had been dropped. The ripples were still there, but they were already losing their urgency. After a minute, he realized something surprising. The anxious thought had faded on its own. It hadn't required a plan, a message, or a sudden decision. It had simply arrived, and then passed through him like wind through the valley. Daniel shifted his weight slightly and smiled in a quiet, almost embarrassed way. "So the trick is just standing here?" he asked. The older man chuckled softly. "Not exactly," he said. "It's remembering that you can stand." Daniel looked again at the rope stretching toward the distant cliffs. The bridge still moved, the wind still whispered, and the future still held its unanswered questions. But now, instead of feeling like a trembling path he had to escape, the bridge felt more like something he could learn to walk with. And as he stood there practicing stillness between one breath and the next, Daniel began to wonder how different life might feel if he carried this quiet balance beyond the bridge, into the ordinary moments waiting for him on the other side. A few days later, Daniel found himself far from the valley, sitting at a small table by a window. The city outside moved the way cities always do, cars passing, conversations rising and fading, life unfolding without asking permission. Yet something inside him felt different, though he couldn't quite explain it yet. His phone lit up on the table. The message he had been waiting for finally appeared. Short, vague, not entirely reassuring. A week earlier, that single line might have sent his thoughts racing across every possible explanation. His mind would have rushed onto the bridge again. For a moment, the old instinct stirred. His chest tightened slightly, and the familiar urge whispered, "Respond now. Fix it. Make it clear." Daniel felt it rising the same way wind begins to tug at the ropes of a bridge. But then he remembered the wood beneath his feet. Not the real bridge, of course, but the quiet lesson it had offered. So instead of reacting, he placed the phone gently on the table and let his shoulders soften. One slow breath entered his lungs. Another followed. The room was still. The world hadn't collapsed while he paused. The tension inside him began to loosen. Just as the bridge had steadied when he stopped rushing across it, Daniel looked down at the table and smiled slightly. It was almost funny how small the practice was. Just breathing, just waiting a moment before letting the mind sprint ahead. Nothing dramatic. Yet somehow the ground beneath his thoughts felt steadier. Later that afternoon, a colleague spoke sharply during a meeting. The words landed with that familiar sting people know all too well. The old Daniel might have defended himself immediately, voice rising to match the tension in the room. But instead, he felt the imaginary bridge beneath his feet again. He paused. One quiet breath, then another. The moment softened just enough for him to respond calmly rather than react. To his surprise, the conversation settled quickly, like water that clears once the stirring stops. That evening, as the sky faded into the soft blue of approaching night, Daniel realized something simple yet powerful. The bridge hadn't only existed in the valley. It appeared in everyday moments, in criticism, in uncertainty, in silence that asked for patience. And once you knew how to stand still on that bridge, something inside you began to feel quietly unshaken, even when life continued to sway. A few evenings later, Daniel returned to the valley. Not because something had gone wrong and not because life had suddenly become easier. The world still held its questions, its pauses, its moments that refused to reveal their meaning right away. But the bridge had become something different to him now, less like an obstacle, more like a quiet teacher waiting patiently. He stepped onto the wooden planks slowly this time. The familiar sway greeted him like an old rhythm he no longer feared. The ropes moved gently in the breeze, and the valley below stretched wide and calm, as if nothing in the world was in a hurry. Daniel stopped halfway across and placed both hands lightly on the rope, not gripping, just resting. For a moment he simply stood there, feeling the solid presence of the wood beneath his feet. Then he took one slow breath, the same way the mentor had shown him. In through the nose, out through the mouth. It wasn't dramatic. No lightning of realization, no sudden silence in the mind. Just a small pause. Yet within that pause, the body seemed to remember something simple. The ground was still holding him. The bridge swayed a little, of course. Bridges always do. But Daniel noticed how different the movement felt when he wasn't fighting it. Instead of reacting, he allowed the motion to pass through his stance, like a tree allowing wind to move through its branches. He even whispered softly to himself, half smiling, "The bridge knows how to balance." Then he tried something the mentor had once suggested quietly. Daniel closed his eyes for just a few seconds and imagined roots growing from the soles of his feet into the wood beneath him. Not literally, of course, just a small picture in the mind. The effect was surprisingly calming. When he opened his eyes again, the valley looked the same as before, yet his body felt more settled within it. Anyone passing by might have thought he was simply standing on a bridge, enjoying the evening air. But Daniel knew something subtle had happened inside that stillness, something that could be practiced anywhere, even in the middle of an uncertain moment. And as he looked toward the far side of the valley, another thought quietly began forming, one that would reveal why this simple practice mattered far beyond the bridge itself. The next morning arrived quietly, the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself with urgency. The valley rested under a pale golden light, and the bridge hung gently between the two cliffs, moving almost imperceptibly with the breeze. Daniel stood at the edge before stepping onto it, noticing how different the moment felt compared to the first time he had crossed. Back then, the bridge had seemed like a test he needed to survive. Now it felt more like a conversation, something that moved with him rather than against him. The ropes stretched patiently across the valley, neither promising perfect stillness nor threatening collapse. They simply held their place. Daniel walked a few steps onto the planks and stopped midway, almost out of habit now. The bridge swayed slightly beneath him, just as it always had, but instead of tightening his body, He allowed the movement to exist without resistance. One slow breath, then another. The valley stretched below him exactly as it always had. Wide, uncertain, full of distances no one could predict. Life, he realized, wasn't so different. People waited for certainty the way travelers waited for the wind to stop. Yet the wind rarely stopped for long. The older man's voice echoed in his memory with gentle clarity. Stability doesn't come from controlling the bridge. It comes from remembering how to stand on it. Daniel looked down at the wood beneath his feet and smiled quietly. The bridge would always move. Circumstances would change. Words might sting. Plans might shift. But none of those things had the power to shake someone who had learned where their balance lived. He placed one hand lightly on the rope and allowed himself another calm breath, feeling the bridge settle once more beneath his steady stance. And in that simple moment, suspended above the valley, surrounded by wind that no longer felt threatening, Daniel understood something that most people spend years chasing without realizing it. Security had never been waiting on the other side of the bridge. It had been standing quietly beneath his feet all along, waiting for him to stop running long enough to feel it.